He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. May God add his own blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Stories are really important to who we are and how we live. And there are stories that make a difference for us. And sometimes what a story does is it makes us want to know more. For instance, when Josie found herself in the alternate dimension and didn't know how to get back and was there for almost a year, all of her friends back at the school wanted to know how they could help her but didn't know where she was. And so fortunately, her clone was able to find her in time, in time and space, in the dimension of time that she was in, and help her get back so that she could save time and space from Mr. Aberdeen, who is going to use the power of controlling it for his own benefit. Was she able to succeed? Don't you want to know? You have to watch a TV show called Strange Days at Blake Holsey High. Right? You ever heard of it? Why not? It's hard to find. Anyway, yeah, she did. She saved the world. The strange thing was Mr. Aberdeen turned out to be her father, who had originally been born back in the 1800s, but had been using time travel. All right, but stories draw us in, don't they? See, now some of you at least are a little curious about that, and I know a few of you are going to go back like, where do I find that? And you're going to try. But there are other kind of stories, responses we have to stories too. When C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, the 7 books, the last book was The Last Battle. It was called The Last Battle. It's a book that we used when I used to teach religion courses at Central Methodist College. We used that book as a way to teach about the end times, to consider Christian thought about the end times of the world and of the universe and how that fits in Christian faith. And there's a part of the story where the Jesus figure called Aslan, a lion, stood at the doorway to heaven and he cried out in a loud voice, "Time," meaning it's time for things to end. It's time. And all things that existed, people, animals, trees, nature things, stars, everything came running at the door. And as Aslan stood there, they looked into his face. And if they saw kindness and welcome on his face, they ran into the door and into heaven. But if they saw fear or anger or something like that menacing, and they felt fear, then they ran past the door. And when all things had run past the door closed. Aslan closed the door, and that was the end for one world, but the beginning of another. What does that mean? Sometimes stories draw meaning to us. They create a kind of a desire within us to discover more, to learn more. And if you really want to understand more about that, you've got to read the book, and then you've got to start comparing certain Bible symbols and truths and stories to that one, which we're not going to do today. But stories have different things. They do different things. They evoke different responses in us, and they become really important to us. They help define who we are sometimes. They talk about moments in our own personal history or in collective history that help us understand what it means to be somebody or something. For instance, as United States citizens, there are certain stories that we look at that help bind us together with a common spirit. The story of how the Declaration of Independence was written, for instance. And there's certain key words or key elements that will bring those stories to mind. We'll think about the signature of John Hancock, signing that in big letters so everybody who reads it can see his name first, making a statement, part of the story. We might think back to, when I was a kid, I always loved the story of John Wesley. I like his stories too. I'm thinking George Washington cutting down a cherry tree. That story with the hatchet that his father gave him, and he cuts down the cherry tree. When his dad asks him, "Did you do that?" And George's response was, "Can't tell a lie." Does that teach us something about who we are as a people and what we value? It does. We call those myths, M-Y-T-H. By definition, a myth doesn't mean something's true or false. It means it's a story that helps us define or understand our culture. the one that we live in. It can be true. It can be made up. It doesn't matter. It's a story that teaches us about who we are, that helps us with our identity. And that's one of those great stories. I hardly ever hear that story anymore. I'm delighted that it's known. Stories do a lot of things for us. The Bible is filled with these wonderful stories about all kinds of people and events and occasions. You know, we've got David and Goliath, of course, is a great story. And there's Joseph, not Mary and Joseph, the other Joseph in the Old Testament. We learn about, we can read about the story of how his brothers sold him into slavery into Egypt and fooled their dad into thinking he was dead because they were aggravated with him. But out of that event, the whole story involves times where they eventually, in a time of famine, come looking for food. And Joseph, because of his own faithfulness and resourcefulness, he's been able to land a position of authority that enables him to bring his family safely to Egypt. So part of Egypt called Goshen. And that becomes, the Pharaoh gives them that land for theirs. The land of Goshen. When I was a kid, Dad used to say that was kind of like, good grief. He would go, land of Goshen. I used to think he was saying Atlantic Ocean. But no, it wasn't. And I picked that one up. We become our parents. Are you guys all aware of this? You know that you will become your parents even if you don't want to be. There's nothing you can do about it. So just, enjoy the ride. It's true. It's true. But that's a story that involves those people. And then the people leaving, 400 years later, of course, Moses comes back and leads them out of Egypt. Stories that help define it. And that's our story, right? If we're Christian people, that's part of our history. Those are our people. That's our spiritual heritage. That was Moses leading us, our people, out of slavery. And that story, that's a long story. It's a huge, pivotal story. That whole series of events that go to the Red Sea and then to the Promised Land where the spies are sent in and they come back afraid, except, of course, for Josh and Caleb. Funny, we named our sons Josh and Caleb. I wonder if that had anything to do with it. It actually did. But the rest of them were afraid, and the people are afraid, so there's wandering in the wilderness, and there's stories about that, and God providing manna, and then they finally go in and they conquer. God leads them in conquest. All these stories. Stories about how they failed in their faith over years, and how God disciplined them and taught them by allowing them to suffer a variety of circumstances, military defeat, sometimes even exile. In the case of the northern countries under Assyria, the 10 northern tribes, those tribes disappeared. Then the 2 southern tribes were taken by Babylon. They came back. And then the Romans came, and then there are all kinds of things. There's stories after stories. But guess what's not in the Bible very often? I mean, all these stories, guess what's not there? It's all the stuff that's not stories. Now, this is not a silly kind of point. This is something to think about. For instance, the easiest one for me to use as an example, we talked about Joseph, who brings his family during the time of famine into Egypt, into the land of Goshen. And then 400 years later, Moses comes to lead them out of slavery. But there's 400 years that we don't know anything about other than they were slaves. 400 years, it happened. David and Goliath, we've got this story that we see about this young man who has tremendous faith in God, such faith, in fact, that he is willing to take on what we're led to believe, it's implied, the greatest warrior of all time that they'd ever known. Goliath, huge, strong, virtually indestructible. And David, this little runt that no one in his family, they always put him out with the sheep because he's the youngest and he didn't have any say. Being a shepherd in those days, that was the low end of the totem pole. You didn't want that job. And when Samuel goes at one point to find the new king to replace Saul, and he's led by God to David's home, and Samuel says to David's father, trot your sons out here because one of your boys is going to be the next king. They don't even bring David out. They don't think enough of him even to bring him out for Samuel to have a look. But that little runt right there is the one who stands up before Goliath with his little slingshot, slays the giant. But what do we not see in the story? How did he get that way? See, how he got that way is in all the stuff that we don't see. All the stuff that's not in the story. That's how he got there. When I was a kid, we'd get together for different meals. We didn't do this. We ate basically every night together as a family, a good family in that regard. And but at Thanksgiving, for some reason, that was the one where it evolved in our family to that was the story night. And usually it was us kids trying to think of stories that we thought were funny about our parents. You know, hey, Dad, tell us about the time again that we saw you walk into the wall. Stuff, And that's not much of a story, but it was something we always like to remember, because Dad had size 15 feet. I don't know how he could even get to the wall. That was always a mystery to me. I saw it happen. I'm not going to tell the whole thing. But that always led into Mom laughing. And they were like, what are you laughing about, Mom? It happened this way every year. And it was so much fun. And she'd say, she'd talk about when they had just gotten married. And Dad was a young pastor, and she would iron his shirts and starch them on Saturday night so be ready for church on Sunday morning. And she'd hang them in the doorway of the closet with the closet door open so it would dry and set proper with the starch. And one night she put it over the bathroom door next to the closet instead of the closet door. So in the middle of the night when he got up to go to the bathroom, he walked into the closet and hit his head on the shelf. See, we all thought that was hilarious. Dad never thought it was funny. Stories, they help define us as they're just family, identity stories in a way. You all have your own things like that, and you've done it. And they have power. But what's not in the stories? It's all the other day by day stuff. That's really not that interesting. That Micah has this bit of wisdom for us. It's really, really a key wisdom. And it's not really a story. It's more of a statement, of a declaration. What does God require of you, oh man, mortal person? What does he require of you except that you do justice, you love mercy, and you walk humbly with your God? Man, that's powerful. That is unbelievable. Think about how that's said. I think it's very purposeful. You do justice. You do that. He requires that you do that, but he also requires more that you love mercy. It says kindness here. Some translations say mercy. Isn't God gracious? And aren't we grateful? I mean, it would be fair for God to be just with us. We've earned what we've earned, good or bad, and that's justice. But God is merciful. And in his nature, he wants us to love that mercy and to walk humbly with God. Not to count ourselves more than we are. To remember that we serve one who is greater, the one who creates, the one who sustains, the one who is the author and the source of all things. When does that come into the story? Well, it comes in a lot of times in the stories. But here's why I think it's there. See, I think people rise to occasions because the character they need for that, what's within them that they need, the strength for that, has already been placed. Why could David stand up to Goliath? Because in all the times we don't see, all the everyday stuff, he had learned what it meant to have courage and to be faithful and to honor and to revere God and to hold God up in great esteem and to trust in his strength and in his presence and his might. That was already in David. He didn't just wake up and go, well, maybe if God will help, we can do this. Let me give it a whack, huh? No, it was already there. By those same people, apparently, who didn't think he was worth Samuel having to look at to be a possibility of a king. It had already been placed there. Moses. We mentioned this, I think it was just last week, or maybe it was in very recent times, but we talked about Moses a little bit, about coming out of a people who'd been slaves for 400 years. How do you get a leader out of somebody who's been nothing but a slave? Remember, he was drawn out of, because he was hidden in the rushes and pulled out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the palace. He was raised as a prince. He was raised as a leader. Isn't it amazing how God does these things? He was, in that everyday stuff, we don't know anything really about how he was raised. We just know he was raised with the royal family. And royal families were raised to do what? To rule, to lead. So when the people needed someone of themselves who could lead, where was that person? God provided him through this miraculous chain of events. But all that leadership, all that ability and that kind of strength came to Moses how? In those everyday times that we don't see in the story. It's remarkable. I could describe a whole lot of days to you in my life that are totally unremarkable. Totally unremarkable. I read a lot. I read voraciously as a child. I read things I didn't even understand. I'd read 5 or 7 books of H.G. Wells by the time I was out of 4th grade. I have no clue. I don't even remember them. I do now. I've seen the movies since then. That was just slightly amusing. You didn't even smile. Thank you. That's better. So okay, so you can picture me laying on the floor reading. Very exciting stuff, isn't it? See, I have this idea that the idea of quality and quantity time, we always talk about the value of quality time. It is valuable. It's incredibly meaningful. And events that are worthy of stories are important to us, and they help us define our lives and who we are, the divine circumstances in various ways. You guys talked about, how many of you went to Philmont and climbed Mount Baldy? There's a story about how you got there, isn't there? All right, and it will never, I was there in 1976, right? That's a long time ago. I'll tell you a long story about how we got there. Never forget it. But getting there, I was already that person. It deepened it, all right? It's for me. That's a story that's important, and it will help define a part of who you are. But who you are has more to do with the quantity of time, not the quality. I really believe that. The time we spend, the fact that I knew that my mother was going to have a meal on the table, never questioned it. It was just there. The knowledge, the understanding, it was just there. The dad was always going to make sure that we had what we needed, we were provided for. That basic thing, I know that's traditional, and it's not always the way we even think things should be nowadays, but for me, that was what defined us. That's what made sense. Still does. We become our parents. I'm still my folks. Those kinds of things. Knowing that if I needed help with something, that they were going to find a way to do it. Knowing that what we believed in or what was important to us became important to my folks. My dad actually skipped an award bank. He won an award, but he knew how badly I wanted to go to the playoff basketball game for my high school, and he actually skipped his award banquet so I could go. More to the story than that, but that's the basic. I've never forgotten that. Now, that's kind of an event, but it's built out of the kind of character that was put into us as we were growing by the day-by-day stuff. The demand that we were honest with each other. You can make your mistakes, you can be stupid, but you better be honest about it. Man, that was drilled into us. The everyday stuff is so critical. There's so much power in that. So what I would like to challenge you all to do is to take this verse of Micah, this verse 6:8. Do what God calls in the Old Testament, writing it upon your heart. Jesus says in the New Testament, if you love God and you love neighbor as self, and you follow these 2 laws, everything else comes with it. The concept in the Old Testament is writing the laws on your heart. So it's a part of you, so it's part of your nature. Let this become part of your nature, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. and live that in the everyday. Let that become a part of you in the everyday. The power of that is when you need it for story time. See what I mean? When you need it for story time, it's going to be there. It's going to be there. It's powerful. It's very powerful. To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Amen.